Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at the Revolution of 1848. And our focus question will be, what sorts of divisions did the Revolution of 1848 expose among anti-conservative forces? Give some examples. So grab a pen and paper, a tablet, and a keyboard, and we'll begin. So we've been talking about the post-Vienna world. You'll remember the Congress of Vienna was this big international agreement, mostly dominated by conservative forces, many of them very resistant to the changes that had begun during the French Revolution. They saw liberalism as a threat. Never mind more radical democratic movements and, God forbid, socialist movements. Another major concern of theirs was the rising tide of nationalism, which threatened to break up some of their empires. And so for the first few decades of the 19th century, they were more or less able to keep a lid on some of these forces. But as we're going to see in 1848, these all kind of come to a head and blow up to some degree. Okay, so why 1848? Well, the 1840s in general was a time of deepening economic turmoil. And some of you are probably actually somewhat familiar with this. In the U.S., the 1840s saw the first major wave of European immigrants, and most of them came from Ireland. And as many of you know, the reason they were coming from Ireland was because of the potato famine. And so Ireland had the worst of it, but all across Europe, the 1840s was a time of crop failures. And since most of the continent was still, even in 1840, agrarian, crop failures are going to be a problem. We know that, if you think back quite a few lectures, we also know that rural living isn't that great to begin with because, with increasing mechanization and rising populations, there's already an issue with agrarian overcrowding. But in the 1840s, this gets really bad. 1848 is a really, really bad year for it. A lot of hunger, a lot of destitution in the countryside. This is going to, the misery will spread to the cities because this is going to mean higher bread prices. If you think back to the French Revolution, this is always a problem. It's still a problem around the world for a lot of governments when the price of wheat or bread or whatever it is that they eat goes up. Well, this led to, with peasants just eking out a living, it led to less demand for industrial products, which led to layoffs. And so now you've got hunger and you have layoffs in cities. It's a problem. We also know that there's this increasing change socially that's happening in Europe. On the upper end, there's the middle class, right? And so as industrialization is progressing, more people are moving into what we would call the middle classes. These are wealthy, talented, educated folks. And in most places, outside of Britain anyways, they don't really have political power that's commensurate with their economic power, where they believe that they see themselves as leaders of society, yet in most places, particularly in the East, they're really treated as marginalized second-class citizens. Of course, it's not just confined to the middle echelons of society, though. All across Europe, as industrialization progresses, we've got more people from the lower classes who are trickling into cities. Cities are growing. Oftentimes, they're part of this growing proletariat. Maybe on the lower middle side of things, you have people who had been able to make a decent living by doing handcrafts, whether they're weavers, and they feel themselves being challenged and pulled into this proletariat class. And so yeah, the 1840s is a time of a lot of social change as well. And of course, we know all across Europe, with again the exception of Great Britain, we have pretty reactionary governments, very, very conservative governments who are absolutist. They're intent on suppressing all forms of protest. They tend to lump liberals, nationalists, socialists all into the same category as equally bad. They're very fearful that there could be protest movements that get out of hand and could lead to turmoil. And we add to that, we have a lot of nationalist movements that are beginning to become more entrenched and are seeking to either overthrow the existing governments and create their own national government, or looking for some sort of political change. Well, this all comes to a head in 1848, and if you guessed, if you had France on your bingo card as the place where the revolution is going to break out, you'd be correct, because it's going to start here. Now, France had a constitution of sorts. So they weren't even the most conservative country by any means. Again, the Bourbon monarchs had come back into power. The king's brother initially, King Louis XVI's brother, had initially taken the reins. And there was a constitution, a very weak one, and there was even a national assembly. But, and this is a pretty big but, in a country of 27 million or so, only 100,000 people could vote. Okay, and so this was 0.002% of the population. This is the grande bourgeoisie, right? The super ultra rich. The Bourbons decided that it would be in their interest to at least give these people a seat at the table. And, you know, obviously for most people at the time, this is just laughable. This isn't really a national assembly. There's no way that the grande bourgeoisie would represent the nation. France is facing this agrarian collapse like everybody else. It's facing the industrial hardship. And the position of the king is getting more and more untenable. The king at this time in 1848 is a man by the name of Louis Philippe. And Louis Philippe attempts to increase censorship, realizing just how unpopular he is. This sets off protests. Students and workers, who tend to be the most radical elements in Europe at this time, they march into the streets to protest. They set up barricades. The National Guard is called in to fire on the protesters. But rather than fire on the protesters, the National Guard, who are usually made up of middle class and middle class, lower middle class people, they identify with the protesters against the government. They join them, and the resistance to the protests collapse. The chambers of the National Assembly are invaded. Louis Philippe, realizing that he could very well be facing a very hostile crowd at any time, abdicates on February 24th of 1848. So he just quits, he resigns. The monarchy collapses, and the revolutionaries set up a provisional government. Okay, so a provisional government is a temporary government, usually in order to figure out what we're going to do next. Okay, and so with the expulsion of the Bourbons, France is declared a republic. This is known as the Second Republic. And they decide that they're going to create a new constitution, and they're going to determine what this constitution will be, based on universal male suffrage. So France decides it's going to have elections, and people will, all males across the country will be able to vote, and will determine what this new constitution will look like. So exciting times for France. Now, over in Germany, things are also complicated in 1848. Here, liberals are especially frustrated because, well, they lack opportunity in government. They're shut out by the nobility. The government is very authoritarian, much more so than France had been. Well, governments, I should say, because Germany is a patchwork, you can see here, of different states. Prussia and Austria are the largest, but there's, I think it's 38 or so states. And things, they're facing similar problems. Artisans feel pressed by the Industrial Revolution. Many of these people are starting to lose their businesses, joining the ranks of the proletariat. And in Germany, there's also this national issue where the Germans would like to unite. Instead of having 38 different governments, have one united German government. Goal of nationalists. Well, there's a saying at this time in Europe, is that when France sneezes, the rest of Europe catches a cold. And so the French Revolution of 1848 begins to spread. Inspired by events in France, workers begin to take to the streets. They're joined by students. There's clashes in the German states with the various monarchs that are there. And the unity of the protesters is so strong that even Frederick Wilhelm, the King of Prussia, loses his nerve. And he's forced to parade with the new German flag, and he agrees to a constitution. Okay? And so Frederick Wilhelm, the King of Prussia, agrees to what the revolutionaries are demanding, that there will be a constitution. Meanwhile, he gets out. He withdraws to the countryside, realizing that the capital of Prussia is too dangerous to be in. And so he doesn't leave the country like Louis Philippe in France did, but he does retire to the countryside to watch and wait and see what happens. And it's the same elsewhere in the other German states. In March of 1848, there's an announcement that a Vorparlament will be called. And a Vorparlament is, I believe it's the German translation of a before Parliament. All right. And just like in France, the goal is to begin to work on a constitution. And this will be a constitution for Germany. And so the delegates that are going to meet here are going to have to decide what this new nation of Germany, what its constitution will be. And so things start to move very, very rapidly. And the contagion spreads to Austria. Austria, of course, is even more complicated because it's a multinational empire. You can see here in the orange color, the ruling Habsburg dynasty is German-speaking, and Vienna is German-speaking, but that's only about a quarter of the population of this empire. The rest are made up of Croats and Bosniaks and Czechs and Poles, and especially Hungarians are another really big ethnic group in this multinational empire. Now, Vienna is much more like Paris and Berlin in the sense that it's developed. So a lot of the eastern part of the Austrian Empire is still quite rural. But Vienna is actually starting to go through the Industrial Revolution. The bourgeoisie is small, but it is influential there. And, so there's a, Austria has really two things happening, two almost separate things. One is the social pressures, industrial pressures in the German parts in Austria, in Vienna, where people are demanding liberal reforms. But then in the rest of the empire, you have nations who are starting to clamor for independence. And so a very complicated and messy situation there. And so sure enough, in Austria, workers and students take to the streets, demanding change, and this happens in March. The protests are so violent that they force the resignation of Clemens von Metternich, who I mentioned last time. He's this arch-conservative diplomat, the architect of the Congress of Vienna. And they demand a new constitution and consider maybe even joining Germany. And meanwhile, out in the countryside, you have these nationalist movements. Various regions dominated by one ethnicity or another start to declare independence. So in the north, and what would now be the Czech Republic, Bohemia as it's called at that time, seeks to break away. Hungary, which you can see here, sometimes they're called the Magyars, but they're in purple here. But Hungary really claims a lot more than just the areas you see in purple. Really, the eastern half of the empire, for historical reasons, the Hungarians claim that that's Hungary. And so they seek to break away, and they create a national government. They form a diet, or a parliament, I guess we could call it. And this parliament begins to act independently. It abolishes serfdom. It declares that Hungarian is going to be the national language of this region. There's also a breakaway movement in Italy. Italian patriots rise up, throw out the Austrians out of northern Italy. They unite with their Italian countrymen across the peninsula. And they're influenced by this movement that has been really becoming popular in Italy since at least the time of Napoleon. And this movement is called the Risorgimento. And the idea in the goal of the members of the Young Italy, as they're called, or people who believe in the Risorgimento, is a national movement for Italian unification, and they want to create Italy. And so it seems as if the Austrian Empire is breaking apart. Okay. So all over Europe in the spring of 1848, we have these national movements, and it's looking pretty good if you're a revolutionary at this point. What I want to do now is I want to swing around and backtrack and go back to where we started and see how this all turns out. And we'll go back to France and start there. Oh, this is before we do that, these are the nationalist movements. So you can see Hungary is going to claim a big part of the empire, and then in the east, the Italians are also going to claim a significant portion. Okay, so as I said, we're going to swing back around, talk about France. So the government's been overthrown, the revolutionaries have done it, but once the king is out of the way, and, you know, once the unifying factor, the thing that was uniting the revolutionaries, which was the conservative government, was gone, well, some of the social issues start to bubble up. Now, one of the delegates for the this intermediate government that's working on the Constitution in the spring was a guy by the name of Louis Blanc. And Louis Blanc was a socialist. And as a powerful minister in this new government, he convinced the government to create something called national workshops. Louis Blanc and many Frenchmen realized it was a big problem. This unemployment problem was a big issue. And Louis Blanc had the idea of creating national workshops. And these were going to be government-run facilities. And what they were going to do is they were going to put people to work doing various public works projects, maybe building roads or railroads or constructing things, whatever the case may be. And the idea was these would be run by the government, and being a socialist, Blanc thought that this was a direction that they could go in. All right. Government owning the means of production was an old socialist idea. And at the same time, there would be a way to get unemployed people back to work. And so this proved to be very popular on one level. So the wages were good, and so a lot of unemployed men started to show up and found work. And there was work for them to do. But then word started to get out that there were good jobs available in Paris, where these national workshops were set up. And so people from other French cities started to come to Paris. And that didn't stop either, because word started to get out, and then even people from other countries started to come when they found out that there was work and pay in Paris. And so by April or May, something like 115,000 people had migrated into Paris and were expecting work at these national workshops. So many people, in fact, that there just wasn't enough work to go around. And of course, to pay for these national workshops, the government had to start to increase the taxes. And so taxes started to go up very rapidly, like 45%. And the way the tax structure was set up at the time, yes, it did hit the wealthy, but it also hit many peasants. And so many peasants and smaller landowners were shocked when they found out how much they owed in taxes, and when they found out it was going to Paris, which most of them didn't like anyways, and that it was going to pay for workers who weren't actually working. I mean, some of them were, but for the most part, there wasn't enough. this really enraged the public against Louis Blanc and against these national workshops and even against the workers themselves. And with all these people there became a real, 115,000 people in Paris who had believed they were entitled to work. And there was a real fear for violence as well, and the perception that these people were lazy. All right, well, while this is going on, these issues, the Constitutional Assembly, the group charged with creating the new Constitution, had finally created its, had finally finished its work, and it was time to have elections. And as I said, these elections were going to be based off universal male suffrage. So every man in France was going to have the right to vote. And so this was very scary for many conservatives. You know, they were already really concerned about these national workshops, and now there's this this specter, this you're going to give every person a right to vote, and they were really expecting the voters to elect some really very far left candidate. But they were pleasantly surprised that many of the candidates that were elected were actually pretty moderate. And the reason for this was that the peasants, who still made up the majority of the population, were actually quite conservative. You know, in the minds of many conservatives, if someone didn't have money, they were going to automatically be far leftist radicals. And maybe that would have been true in cities, but most of the peasants were actually quite conservative. And so the government that was elected was pretty like center-right. And this center-right government was receptive to many of the complaints of peasants and landowners in general about these national workshops. And so they announced that they were going to stop them immediately. And this was very troubling to many of the urban workers whose numbers were now swelled. And they attempted a coup on this new National Assembly. The National Guard was called out, and everybody held their breath. Which way was the National Guard going to go? Were they going to side with the workers, or were they going to side with this National Assembly? And to the relief of the National Assembly, most of the National Guard troops sided with the National Assembly against the workers. As I said earlier, most of them were from middle class or maybe peasant backgrounds. Well, this led to 3 days of violence, which became known as the June Days. All right. And this pitted the workers who were in Paris, now flying the red flag of socialism, versus the propertied classes. And by property, we don't mean just the middle classes, but also peasants, who were also small property owners of their own. In these battles, 4,100 people were killed and 1,200 arrested. The arrested were exclusively workers, and most of the people killed were also workers. And so this is really the first widespread instance of class war that we have in Europe. All right, but the workers are crushed, and the new government is successful. Now, there was one office left to fill, and that was going to be the president of this new French Republic. And so there were several candidates, and these elections happened again in the against the backdrop of first the national workshops and then the June Days. And this had really solidified in the minds of many people just how dangerous workers could be. And so many people in France were looking for a law and order candidate during that election cycle. And of the four major candidates, one was won pretty handily, and that, of course, was Napoleon. Well, no, not that Napoleon. He was dead, but his nephew, Napoleon III, or Louis Napoleon, as he's sometimes called. Now, people didn't vote for Louis Napoleon because they knew exactly where he stood on issues and they agreed with him. He just had name recognition, and actually people weren't really sure where he stood. And that's because, like his uncle, he took a lot of positions on a lot of different things, and they weren't always consistent. So we'll have an opportunity to see more of Louis Napoleon in a bit, but I want to move on to the revolutions in Germany because, well, something similar starts to happen there. The War Parliament started to break down. And the issue there was whether we were going to have a moderate constitution with monarchy, or, as some of the radical members wanted, a republic with no monarchies, abolish the monarchies. All right. There were also issues over suffrage, that is, over who could vote. Radicals wanted a system of universal male suffrage, every man having the right to vote, whereas moderate liberals wanted some sort of suffrage based on property qualifications. And this was a big source of contention. And this begins to cause a rift between liberal and more radical members who had previously been on the same side. They agreed that they didn't want to live under the Prussian monarchy or any of the other monarchs, but they found that they didn't really have all that much in common other than that. Meanwhile, social unrest was disrupting Germany. You know, just because there was a revolution didn't mean the economic issues went away or anything like that. And so handicraft workers were striking for guild protections. Violent worker revolts broke out in places. There was destruction of property. And so many middle-class people began to become very fearful that maybe it would be their property that was attacked next. And so they started to draw closer to the old regime. You know, they didn't particularly like the old regimes that were now out of power, but they really didn't like people threatening their property. And so this gave the conservative princes and kings a boost of confidence. And they began to come out of their rural castles and rural domains and to begin to come back into power with their militaries. So again, they hadn't ever left the country. They hadn't disbanded their military. They had just withdrawn. And so they launch a counterinsurgency, sometimes with the backing of middle-class people. And so Frederick Wilhelm dissolves the Prussian parliament. The German parliament, the War Parliament, is its constitution is rejected. They had finally agreed that Frederick Wilhelm could be the monarch of United Germany, but he rejected it. He said he didn't want a constitution from the gutter, as he called it. And this was imitated right across Germany, whether it was Bavaria or places in the Rhineland. These places, the old monarchs, the old kings came out of hiding and reasserted themselves. And the constitution that was created was was never put into effect, and Germany was going to remain unformed and was going to go back to its 38 separate provinces, or countries, I guess you could say it, states. And one of the small concessions that did last, though, and this is something that's going to be a factor, is Frederick Wilhelm had agreed to a constitution for Prussia. Now, again, this isn't the German constitution, but this is a constitution for Prussia. So he did agree, he had agreed that he was going to work with some sort of a parliament. And so he did keep that part of his word, but we'll see how that plays out. Now, meanwhile, in Austria, basically the same thing is going to happen. The revolutionaries are going to divide, and they're going to divide along ideological and class lines. All right. The Habsburgs were in their country estates waiting this thing out. Students and workers made radical demands, some of them socialist or anarchical. Their former allies, the middle class conservatives, begin to side with the regime. The Austrian crown comes back. The Habsburgs come back. They shell the city of Vienna. Thousands of workers are killed. And this happens in October of 1848. They're able to reassert control. But it's a little more complicated out in the rest of the empire, because here you're not dealing with students and workers, but you're dealing with different nationalities that have now declared independence and are now claiming that they're a separate state. Now, Italy collapses pretty quickly, but Hungary proves to be a much tougher nut to crack. And the reason, is because, one, it's pretty big. It's nearly the same size as Austria. And the Hungarians are very, very proud of this new nation that they've created. It's not divided like Austria is. It's broadly liberal and nationalistic. All right. So they began to put through some reforms, and so there's a lot of unity in Hungary. They announced their separation from Austria. They're now a new state as they see it. And so as a new state, and you can see it here, there's this black outline on this map. As a new state, they start to work on creating Hungarian institutions. And so Hungarian is declared the new national language. And this is very popular among Hungarian speakers, or Magyars, again, as they're sometimes called, pictured here in yellow. And, you know, there's now a Hungarian national anthem and Hungarian heroes. They're all celebrated and very popular among Hungarians, but who it's not popular among is all the other people that live there. And so half the population of Hungary is not Hungarian. It's made up of Romanians and Croats and Serbs and Slovaks and various other groups. And they're not really thrilled with this new Hungarian nationalism that's being thrown onto them. They don't want to speak Hungarian. They want their own. They want their own country. They may not be as organized as the Hungarians are, but they really resent this. And the Hungarians are very, you know, they're feeling pretty good about themselves, changing street names and instituting public schools where children are going to learn Hungarian. And for these other groups, they don't want their kids learning Hungarian. And they start to really miss the Austrians, because the Austrians hadn't really ever insisted that people speak German, or they hadn't been anywhere near as insistent upon it anyways. And so these groups grow closer to the Austrian monarchy, which is feeling its own oats now that it's kind of crushed its own internal problems. But even with the resistance of these other nationalities and a renewed Austria, Hungary still proves to be a big problem. The Austrians really can't defeat them. And so Austria calls in a favor from a fellow member of the Holy Alliance, if you remember what that is. And so they call in the arch conservatives of them all. They call in the Russians. All right. Now, we haven't talked about the Russians because, well, they didn't go through this, really. They were so conservative and they had so small of a middle class that they weren't even affected by this. And so Austria calls in a favor, and with Russian help, the Austrians are finally able to defeat the Hungarians. They're able to defeat them, although the Hungarians do fight very bravely. And, you know, for the Russians, it's not only doing a favor for a fellow absolute monarchist, but they don't really like this idea of ethnic minorities getting independence because, well, they're a multi-ethnic state. Don't forget Poland or Finland. And so they see this as a bad example. And in October of 1849, they defeat the Hungarians, ending, finally, the revolutions of 1848. And so, you know, with maybe the exception of France, these revolutions, at least initially, really come to nothing. But we'll see that this is actually far from the truth. All right. Anyhow, what I'd like you to do is I would like you to answer this question. What sorts of divisions did the Revolution of 1848 expose among anti-conservative forces? Give some examples.